professionals in a given field to discuss what we're thinking of as hot topics, in this case, the future of criticism. The idea is that my four guests here are going to have a conversation. It will go organically if we have time. Towards the end, we'll have a Q&A, but we only have an hour. I see at least three general areas of discussion in thinking about the future of art criticism, and I'm just going to speed through so you can get me off the stage and get to what we're actually here for. The first has to do with craft, that is, the question of writing itself, of working with images, and of editing. Editing is also a craft. The second would be the question of platforms, digital versus print, digital modalities, etc. And one might add to that the problematics, the ethical problematics around certain platform issues, around money and funding, around art-world relationships, etc. And then the third general area that we might think about has to do with producers and users, with what I like to think of as the intentional communities formed by art criticism, if such things exist. Particularly for me, as these are reshaped by cultural consciousness, by transnational reach, by questions, or burning questions of diversity, both in terms of voice and of readership. Isn't that interesting? Alphabetical order. Jason Farago is an art critic for the New York Times and the editor of Evie magazine. Seth Rodney is a staff writer and editor for Hyperallergic. Margaret Sundell is the founder and editor of fourcolumns.org, an online publication devoted solely to art criticism. And David Velasco is a critic and editor-in-chief of artforum.com. So I'm going to just hand that to you, Jason.
Slightly daunting beginning, but thank you so much for inviting me and everybody else, and thank all of you for being here. If the first one of those was craft, I suppose I can start just briefly by talking about my own small, slightly schizophrenic career, and maybe you guys could interrupt me. But I've always had one foot in what you could broadly call the art world and one foot in what you could broadly call media. I was trained as an art historian, though only to MA level, figured out a PhD wasn't for me, and began to write for The Guardian, and I wrote for The Guardian until the end of last year, and I'm now with The New York Times. And writing for a popular audience, and writing in a popular register, and trying to do so in a way that was serious without being academic was something that always appealed to me, and perhaps has something to do with the fact that I worked in Britain, where mass media and newspapers in particular have a different position in the media ecosystem and the political ecosystem than they do here. At the same time, I never felt comfortable in the media world proper, and care much more about artists and exhibitions than anything else. And about 2 years ago, having written for magazines like Artforum and Freeze, and having done catalog essays in the way that one does when you're in your 20s and suddenly you have to pay rent in New York, I found a magazine which is called Evie, and which is now 6 issues old, and which, Margaret can also talk about this, I'm sure, takes art as its sort of principal but not exclusive object of inquiry, and it speaks to an audience that is perhaps less generalist. Certainly not, it's not a professional publication, it's not an academic or a tenure-track publication, but it is nevertheless one that has different voice. So, what's more, even as a publication, though I don't write the articles, where stories are 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 words. At the Times, I normally write about 800. When I was at the New Yorker, my reviews could be 100 words or fewer. So craft, I suppose, is in large part a function of medium, a function of audience as well. And certainly when I speak to younger critics or when I speak to younger art historians, what I certainly discover is that though not all art historians are critics and not all critics are historians. For those critics who come from an art history background, the sort of principal roadblock has often been an understanding of medium, and all of us are in overlapping but not identical sort of fields of broadcast, and maybe we could talk about that, about the kind of constraints or the kind of freedoms that the individual medium, whether print or digital, might offer. I mean, you're a website, and therefore you have sort of infinite space, but also have to find an audience.
I suppose that's a good introduction. Excuse me. Yes, Hyperlogic is primarily online. Every once in a while we print out, I think, summer or spring guides to particular sets of shows. Yes, but primarily our audience is found online, and I suppose to give you a kind of encapsulated version of my own history, I wrote before arriving at Hyperlogic, I wrote for a small magazine out in produced out in California called Artillery, and one of the sort of, and maybe I'll just talk about this as a way to talk about craft. One of the things that I could do when I worked for Artillery, because at that moment I was also working on my PhD, which is in museum studies. I'm not an art historian by training. I'm actually someone who's trained to look at the sort of history and the sort of discourse around museums. Anyway, writing for Artillery, I found that because it was a very, very, very part-time job, I had the time and space to craft these sort of highly polished reviews of 500 words, no more than 500 words. I could take probably 2 or 3 weeks to do this, and when I did, what I produced essentially was a kind of jewel, in my humble estimation. And now writing for Hyperlogic, where I write between 5 and 6 posts a week, I don't have the time or luxury to do that. I have to sit down, look at the thing, come to an understanding of it, and then in a couple of hours, produce something that has some sort of semblance of intelligence. And then, of course, I leave it for 24 hours. When I'm saying, of course, like everybody does this, my writing, not style, but habit, is to get a rough draft out, no matter how painful it is, and it's often painful. Leave it for a day, and then come back to it, and make it comprehensible to other people. I've found that writing in this way, being forced to sort of get it out, is actually, it's not awful. It's not great, but what it forces me to do is it forces me to trust my education in a way that I didn't think I could before. I mean, I've been looking at art since I was 16, so 30 years, and I've been thinking seriously about art I did an MFA back in 2000, so I've been thinking quite seriously about art for 16, 17 years. So I'm forced to draw on all of that sort of accumulated knowledge, which is always sort of like percolating beneath the surface of consciousness, right? It's like you walk into a room and you see these objects that you've never seen before, and you have to make sense of them for someone else. And so all these sort of faculties that I suspect I have, but I'm not always sure I have, come into play in that moment of thinking, oh, I have to make sense of this for someone else. It has to be comprehensible, not just to me, but to anyone who will read this online. So, yeah, I think that's what I want to say about that.
Should I switch to this, or did we only have this?
We have both. Both of them work, so we might run out of cable.
Okay. Hi, I have a sort of long and schizophrenic career in which I have been able to practice a number of these different crafts. I very much felt an affinity with what you were talking about, of like the kind of jewel-like 500-word review, which I used to write as a staff reviewer for Art Forum, where there was a certain amount of time for consideration, and then also the kind of precipitous immediacy of working under a very tight deadline, as I know Jason does at the Times, and you do Hyperallergic, and I did when I was the art editor and critic at Time Out. And then also I have a sympathy to Jason's observation about craft as a hurdle for people who are trained academically and moving into criticism, because I have an academic training, I do have a PhD, and one of the things that I noticed as I was in graduate school was the writing, the quality of the writing, the intensity of the description of the works, and the way that the arguments emerged out of the description of the works or out of the description of theoretical ideas was more compelling to me than, say, the job of being an academic and of teaching. And so that led me more towards criticism, and ultimately to what I'm in a really fortunate position to do now, which is to launch a project of my own design, where again, I know Jason also. And is yours a nonprofit?
Actually, no. We're out to make it rain, though that's not out of, out of acquisitiveness. That's out of the sort of. We can talk about that. I would love to,
Yeah.
but no. Ours is an LLC.
Okay. Four Columns is a nonprofit, and it also speaks to another aspect of my professional trajectory, which was running the Creative Capital Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant Program, which was the first program set up to fund arts writers and to acknowledge the kind of abysmal financial circumstances surrounding the compensation of arts writing. So,
And which has made an enormous difference in the lives of no shortage of critics in the city, myself included. And Keith told me that, actually.
yeah. But so that's something that I'm in a position to be able to carry over into Four Columns, which is a part of its mission is to compensate writers appropriately. But I don't know what David wants to go into, but another element of craft that I think, that comes up with this, and which Judith mentioned, is the craft, editing as a craft. And the importance of editing as a craft and the kind of potential obsolescence of editing as an activity, along with the obsolescence potentially of art criticism, but certainly editing may be going out first. But I think that we all here are invested and involved as editors as well as writers, and I think understanding that crafting and that dialogue between the writer and the editor as something that is really intrinsic, I would say. I mean, ideally intrinsic, but is intrinsic to the activity of creating art criticism, which is creating writing for public in the media, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, as opposed to, say, academic books, which I think editing plays a different role. And I want to pass this to David, who could speak both to his experience as an editor and as a writer, and whatever else he desires.
Thank you. I'm reminded of, I don't even know where I read it, but there was somebody who once said that the best editor is the one who can get you money for what you're doing. So I think that that is something that needs to be on the table. Certainly, it's funny to be speaking about the future of art criticism at a time when I don't know what future is, whether there is a future. So there's something I'm still trying to get a grasp on what criticism is at this very moment. When Trump was elected in November, it was kind of a shock for a lot of us, I think. And the first thing I did was I thought, okay, well, I have a platform. It's, I feel impotent in many ways, like all the work that was done politically to try to, elect somebody who might have been a little more suited for the job. Apparently didn't work, but at the very least, I have this small domain in which I can invite people to speak their mind, comment, try to raise some level of resistance. So very quickly we switched gears. We invited a lot of artists and critics and people we trusted to contribute things. We didn't give much of we didn't really predict what would come. We didn't ask for specific things. We just reached out to people we trusted, which is, I think, the job that my job as an editor has always been. It's not to be prescriptive, but to have people I trust and to follow them wherever they go. That's that. I don't know where the future of art criticism is. I don't know where the present of art criticism is, but I know who I trust in the world, and I think that building those communities of writers and people, artists who we trust, is probably the most important thing to me about this field we're in right now. So, I will say very quickly just about my own experience as an editor and writer. The last time I was at a CAA, I was telling Jason yesterday, was in 2005, when I was a marketing assistant for Routledge Books and manning the tables. And it was also at the same time that I won a Young Art Writers Prize for Art Papers magazine on a total win, and that's actually what led to my career at Art Forum. So I have a very strange relationship to CAA. My only real experience here has been as one of those people at the tables, trying to sell you books.
Maybe we could talk about the relationship between some of the sort of economic and political concerns that you were just raising and the question of craft, and what kind of criticism gets written and for whom. I often come back to this distinction that Sven Ludekin makes between a kind of Enlightenment-inspired criticism in which there are sort of universal principles which may or may not actually be sort of propounded anywhere, that a work can objectively succeed or fail on certain terms, and which sort of has a tradition from Diderot through sort of most famously Clement Greenberg, versus a sort of more romantic, open-ended, possibly literary tradition, sort of out of 19th century Germany and through the Frankfurt School and into what sometimes in English is called art writing, and is a sort of another beast. So the tension between these partially overlapping but distinct sort of styles of criticism, I think, is one that they can't necessarily be divorced from questions about medium and indeed questions about money. And I'm interested, David, in what you were saying about how the shock of the election of someone who should not be elected led you to rely on people that you knew, people that you trusted, and basically give them carte blanche, versus, at a place like the Times, where, I could feel it, that in the weeks after, every goddamn review in every department was, now more than ever, balance sheet, now more than ever, we need Monet. I'm not actually sure that's correct. But the sort of, in my primary career, although I shy from exclusionary judgments in the manner that any contemporary sort of post-Greenbergian critic would, of course I am there to make pronouncements with the force of truth behind them. Otherwise, why would you pick up the paper, though there is a presidential tweeter who would tell you that it's all fake anyway. And so yeah, I mean, on the one hand, that kind of freedom that you speak about is indispensable. On the other, I mean, what are the kind of financial and media constraints? Certainly, the internet allows that kind of freedom or reactivity or open-endedness in a way that print media does not. On the other, if you thought it was hard to make a living as an art critic when there were ads in the front of our form, you should try online. And so maybe we could talk about that, about the relationship between those things.
I would like to add that I really admire what Margaret has done, setting up a space for actually trying to compensate writers well. I think that is actually, if there's a future art criticism, that's probably what it is. Like, you have to find a way to pay writers, especially at a time in New York itself, which is, arguably the center of global art criticism, even despite the, efforts of, whatever, despite the dispersion of power. It's impossible to live here if you don't make a shit ton of money, and that's increasingly the case. So finding ways to pay writers. In my case, we rely on advertisements, which isn't always the greatest, but it works to some degree. Some people rely on the largesse of others. Whatever way they're studying, that's finding ways.
Even as supported by advertising as well, which is the reason that we decided to do it for profit, was not because we thought we were going to get rich. We are, it's not a vanity project. It is actually something that has a profit and loss statement. We spoke to our friends at Triple Canopy, we spoke to people at Eflux, and though I would love to hear you talk about the nonprofit model, the model of advertising is still working for us at this moment, though, obviously because of my function previously at The Guardian and now at The Times, I have zero involvement in the sales. And what my publisher would tell you is that, it's a hustle. I mean, it is a serious operation to get done.
Do you feel pressure in terms of coverage, in terms of your relationship between advertising and coverage?
Absolutely not, and if I did, I would quit. Absolutely, 100% not. But the reason I feel that is because I have such a fantastic publisher that she has made that crystal clear to every one of our advertisers. And, it was interesting anecdotally to discover when we were starting the magazine. She would tell me that, we thought we were the hip young magazine, and therefore we went to the hip young galleries. Not only did the hip young galleries have the money, but those that did expected something in return, to which Rebecca said, you get a couple free copies, and maybe we will buy you a drink when you come to the launch party. That's it. And she was summarily told, well, at magazine X, Y, and Z, which I will not name, there's a clear exchange. You could sell shoes and make a lot more money doing that than selling your immortal soul in exchange for that sort of thing. And so, one of the reasons that Even, which is a young magazine, has nevertheless ended up with advertisements from more established galleries is because, one, of the inequality in the art world, but also because it is those places that seem to have wanted an ecosystem, a general ecosystem, and, have we reviewed, if I go back in my head to think of which gallery shows that we've done, the vast majority of our advertisers have never had a review at all.
I think great. So Seth, you work for a mostly online-only publication, which is, I think, probably the hardest to actually raise money for. And there's also, I wonder if you can speak to what it's like. Without, I don't want to also put you on the spot of giving away any trade secrets, but.
No, that's fine. We are on the spot. This is the nature of this conversation. I was thinking, as Jason was speaking about the sort of different models by which businesses essentially make money, that there's a particular concoction that Hyperlogic has come up with that I don't really understand. I don't really understand because I'm on the editorial side, And the business side, though we share the same office, and we sometimes share, we have meetings that bring us together. I don't completely understand what they do. I have only so much brain space, and it gets taken up by lots of other things. But what I do understand about the hyperlogic model is that we actually aren't struggling. I think there was a moment last year when we were a bit wobbly, but aside from advertising, and now I'm getting into territory where I don't know what I'm talking about. I know that we do events. I know that we sponsor particular events, and I know that we get a good deal of our income from advertising, but I also know that that's only one piece of the entire pie. I think there's something called Nectar Ads, which is actually a consortium of businesses that together sort of pool their resources in order to get more advertising dollars. But again, I'm not exactly sure how that works. What I love about being at Hyperallergic is that when I came on board, I was a contributor for several months before I came on staff. I think that was sort of the apprenticeship, let's call it. There was a moment when I wrote a piece, actually it was a piece about internships. And it was published, and the editor-in-chief, Tanya, asked me out to lunch. And over lunch, he said, yeah, I think he kind of pulled back on that piece stuff. And I said, what do you mean pulled back? He said, well, you didn't give your opinion. Now, mind you, I had spent the previous roughly 7 years working on a piece of research in which my opinion was not warranted, right? I think there may be 2 places in my PhD thesis where I used the pronoun I. Maybe. So when he said, we actually want your opinion, that was kind of shocking to me. And I thought, oh, okay, so I'm in the right place, right? He's saying essentially, or he was saying, I trust that you will bring to bear the kind of analytical skills that I know that you have, so that when you render an opinion, it will be a worthwhile one, right? That's amazing to have someone who's my boss essentially tell me, no, go forth and figure it out. So I feel extremely, supported working at Hyperlogic, and I feel like we are one of the few publications around that actually hold people's feet to the fire. And I think that we bring a certain kind of argument. I mean, here's the quick version. We make, I think at the end of the year, each year, we make a list of the 10 least powerful people in the art world. That's what we do.
We were on the list. I think art critics were number 1 year, right? But I think what you just said actually was what I would love to ask you, Margaret, which is about the idea of critical authority, where it comes from, whether it exists, whether its possible disappearance is a good thing or a bad thing, and particularly for young people or for new writers, where that comes from. And I wonder, Margaret, you're working with this sort of nice sort of range of both established and younger writers. Do you find that the younger ones sometimes are they more or less assured of their sort of authority to make judgments? Or have you not noticed an age gap? Maybe that's presumptuous of me.
I mean, I actually don't know this in 4 columns, and so far a correlation between generation and capacity to make authoritative judgments. I can certainly say in my own experience, I felt much more entitled to make authoritative judgments when I was younger. And the very first criticism that I did when I was just out of college, and I definitely felt like making a lot of authoritative judgment. I think the broader question of where does authoritative judgment come from, what are the stakes of it, what are the value of it for criticism, is, the huge question for criticism, right? And I think, for example, there's, even in the distinction between you're talking about your opinion being warranted and you're saying you're making truth claims. So there are questions there too about what the critic is doing and what kind of mantle the critic is putting on or feeling that they put on, like you feel. And I think that that's been a big issue and something that has changed over time. I think that universally authoritative judgments or claims seem very hard to make in the kind of less narrow world that we live in, and I think that those were claims that were being made with a kind of energy at a time when the public sphere was much more narrow and much more clearly defined, when the exhibition venues were much more narrow and much more clearly defined. So I think that it's not clear that that model from a different period comes, but I do think that there are aspects of making staked assertions, staked claims, that have a relationship to value judgments but are not exactly the same as value judgments, that I think are very important. I think in certain instances, simply choosing to cover something or not covering it is a judgment.
Precisely.
The board scores 1 to 0. That's the word.
And not everybody's in the position to do that, because some people are being assigned things and they just have to react to what they're assigned to. But so in other positions, choosing to cover things is itself a kind of judgment. Something else that I was thinking a lot about was that one of the ways in which I got into general audience criticism, which is what I'm trying to do in 4 columns, was a little bit educationally via an apprenticeship at the Whitney Museum's Education Department as a teaching fellow, where I gave gallery talks and tours and kind of classes to members of the general audience. And then I was able to take some of that over into Time Out and realize that there was this general audience, there were members of this general audience that I encountered that felt very inhibited but were very curious, and that it would be possible to write criticism that both gave them the equipment to understand what the sort of terms of the context and the terms of the questions were, while still being able to make serious statements about whether something has to be situated within this context, whether it, in my opinion, failed or succeeded in relationship to the terms it had set up for itself or the context in which it had placed itself, and to do both of those things simultaneously. And that became a kind of gold standard for me, along with the fact that this would come through writing that in a way took itself as seriously as the artwork that it sought to elucidate. So I don't know if this kind of it sort of responds to your question and kind of throws out more, but so I think they're authority, but I go for definitely stakes need to happen.
You don't mind if I just respond to that? Okay, great. So I've been thinking about this as you were speaking and thinking for a long time. I've subscribed to the idea forwarded by the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman that essentially the critic has been rendered obsolete by the marketplace. And this is a 20th century development. So that kind of criticism that you've outlined, which one can follow a through line from Diderot to Clement Greenberg, is for me not the model I subscribe to, because I actually am convinced that Bauman's right, and that to a great extent what someone like me does is that's useful to you is I help you sort things. I say, here's something, when this of course is based on your experience with reading me and coming to trust me, coming to trust my opinion and my judgment. That what I do is I simply help you sort through the plethora of things that you can go and see and experience in museums and galleries. Because to a great extent, the market has, and this is a fairly complicated argument, and I'm trying to think about how to summarize it quickly. As I'm speaking, the market has made it so that, along with this sort of insanely democratizing capabilities of the internet, has made it so that you, as someone who's interested in art and ideas, are inundated daily, hourly, with options for things to train your attention on. My opinion about whether a work succeeds or fails pales in comparison to that sort of responsibility, need. It's a marketplace of ideas. This is the version of culture that we live in. And to be able to say, this is worth looking at, and this thing is not, I think is ultimately helpful to you. At least I hope it is. And what I also try to do while I'm doing that is I try to give you, and this is a sort of romantic version, this sort of, accepting the premise that there are sort of two models for art writing. The romantic version, which is the one I absolutely subscribe to, is that there's an object, and through that object, you can see an entire universe that you were not able to see before. And I just want to be able to point out some of the things in that universe that are available by paying attention to this object, this experience.
One of those points, because I think that these points are intertwined. I mean, your diagnosis that market conditions have vitiated much of central criticism is, I think by this point, pretty contestable, and gets to the point that Margaret was making, that the decision or no to publish a review is basically the only kind of, is in many ways the sort of principal judgment. My evidence for this is often that when I give a negative review, they put it on Facebook and Twitter and they say, look, I got a review. But I guess what I do want to sort of bring up is there's the market of Jeff Koons, and then there's the market of, and Koons is a good artist, by the way, but, and then there's the market of a sort of larger, more digital sphere that, especially if you have an editor, or if you write for a publication that isn't specialized in the art world, people, we all seem to think the art world that is a singular thing that has sort of borders, and yet, there are photographers that sell for millions of dollars in galleries in Las Vegas. There is the sort of Thomas Kincaid phenomenon. And once you've given up on certain Gutenbergian certainties, which I think was a healthy thing, and probably an inevitable thing, one is relatively lightly armed in one's combat against the lightly armed. You sort of brought a pen to a knife fight against the Kincaids of the world, and I and this is what I want to ask you about, if you subscribe in an absolute sense to a sort of more romantic model of criticism in which, the work exists and it's the critic's job to dive in, to elucidate, and to sort of reveal something that we didn't know already. Does that open you to the everyone's a critic claim, right? To the possibility that one's judgments are, maybe better because you have more experience, maybe better because you have better literary style, but ultimately just one other thing on the market. And we know this from other disciplines, particularly literature, where the Jennifer Weiner phenomenon and the idea that sort of young adult literature is now inadmissible and bordering on disqualifying to say that Toni Morrison or Philip Roth is a better writer than the guy who did The Hunger Games. How dare you tell me is a more and more common thing in the domain of literature, certainly in the domain of music. And I wonder if these are things that are sort of secretly, there's a sort of secret enlightenment core to our romantic project.
There's a secret enlightenment core to our romantic.
That ultimately we actually do have certain objective or principles that we never actually articulate. So for example, ambiguity, good, certainty, not so good. Gray and silver, often better than bright colors. Edition of 5 better than infinite edition, right? Like that ultimately we do have these principles that will never actually come out and say.
Well, let me just quickly respond to that. Here's some of the principles that I think I always bring to bear, and which I'm not necessarily always conscious of. I was at an art thingy the other day in the Lower East Side. Actually, I think it was a talk about sort of developing a meditation practice. Anyway, the person who was leading this, very thoughtful guy, and there was a conversation that arose after he was finished with declaiming. And I said something about this political moment actually being, it being very possible that we're going to encounter a lot of bad art. And someone asked me, well, what do you consider bad art? And I said, and I'm not going to be able to reconstruct this exactly, but something like that work that is so sort of draconian in its intention to make you think, to get you to think a particular thing. That's bad art. Because what, again, yeah, well, I suppose that's the correct term. What art does, it's always done for me, which I continue to find fascinating, and which is why I continue to do this, is that I can go into a gallery and see a work, see something, and have no idea what it's about. And then it does nothing for me, right? I walk away and I think, I don't even know why you bothered to do that. And then I walk into another space and I see something, and I say to myself, oh, right. Oh, that's why. Because you're transported. Because you see and understand things that you had not quite seen and understood in that particular way before. And so, the values that I think I'm holding on to are, yes, ambiguity, but I would actually say it differently. I would say complexity. I would say surprise. A kind of a sense that the artist is actually invested in the thing that's made. A sense that it wasn't tossed off, like which is the sense that I get from Jeff Koons all the time, or the sense that I get from all the time, or the sense that I get from Damien Hirst all the time. That it's just sort of, I don't get the sense that there's any emotional, intellectual investment. And so those things are important to me. And I'd really be interested to hear from you all what values are important to you.
I mean, I love that prop art, frankly. Very quickly, I'd like to also make a note that not all criticism is obsolete, though I would embrace its obsolescence in certain forms, for sure. One of the reasons I started writing about dance and getting involved in that field was, first of all, that I fell in love with it. I also do a lot of dance criticism. I'm putting together a series of books for MoMA on different choreographers. And the role of the critic in the dance world is enormous, it's huge. If Alistair McCauley in the New York Times gives a bad review to a piece, it can end a career. It's just like, it's done. So there's a funny way in which in these, overlapping fields, I mean, there's not one actually pure, criticism has many different valences. But, yeah, I don't know. I hate to answer the question of what I value in art because I don't know. I mean, it's like, one of the things that I've grown as a writer to do over time, I started writing, actually I cut my teeth on Seen and Heards for Artmaking, which was a very interesting way to start writing because you had to write something very quickly, it had to kind of be punchy, and that was a really interesting training ground. Then I started writing reviews for the magazine, and at a certain point I stopped thinking about things I didn't like. That was a very interesting moment when I said, I'm not going to bother writing about something that I don't care about or I think is worth my time. I'm only going to write about things I love. I'm only going to write about things that I'm passionate about. I don't know what that's going to be in advance. I hope that I'm caught off guard in some way. And in fact, there was a way in which I assumed that the way to perceive the world was productively to, if you didn't like something or didn't think it was worth your time, was to simply ignore it and maybe it would go away. But to build this kind of foundation for the works that you did admire and that you thought were valuable, and to take on artists who were marginalized in whatever way and give them some sort of platform. But some friends of mine have recently called that into question and actually said, in fact, it's very important to say that there's something wrong with something if you, that there are works that, this is the problem, you write something negative about a show, they tweet about it, and somehow, all publicity is good publicity, that's more holy an idea, but I guess that's an interesting question for me. I would at what point do you ignore, and at what point do you tackle something that you don't like? When is it actually productive for you, I think?
I'm happy to answer the question, if not jumping on it. What Margaret was saying about stakes, I think, gets to answer your question. When a young artist is in a young gallery doing something of no particular interest, then the stakes are relatively low, and I would not want to interrupt that person's possible development or possible disappearance by barreling in and saying, you should have read, more Roncière before you decided to sort of, post your selfies or something. But I suppose there are a couple things. One is that It's a little different with dance, but in visual art, the manner in which the sort of object of inquiry has moved away from individual artworks and towards exhibitions or entire careers has meant that the stakes of criticism and the kinds of judgment, the kinds of questions that are being wrestled with are different questions, often more congruent with questions of politics or economics or society than they might have been in a time when more formalist languages obtained, when judgments seemed to center around individual artworks. So the kind of moments in which I feel a negative or a skeptical review helps quite a bit are precisely those in which the larger political or economic or otherwise principles that seem congruent with a failed aesthetic practice are ones that I cannot support. I don't think that, saying to random painter X that, there are better paintings out there. Sure, I'm more than happy to do that. In particular, in the Friday in the Galleries bit of the New York Times, which I've only just begun to write for, but at that sort of 250-word scale, I do think actually that is valuable. But I don't know, probably the most negative review I've written recently was back when I was at The Guardian, was for the Berlin Biennial that was in June, and talk about Trump vitiating your political project. I mean, we're talking about an exhibition of such moral acuity that one of its sort of principal, one of its protagonists sort of explicitly says in one of the interviews, "We love Trump." And the idea that these people weren't disgraced then and have sort of evaded quite a bit of censure now, though I suppose Hyperlogic also published quite a negative review, is to me unbearable, and I don't hesitate to use the word immoral. I mean, if there's one good thing about the Trump phenomenon, it is that unlike with Bush, Trump's opponents do at least sort of still have certain words like democracy and freedom and goodness on their side, whereas Bush took those from us. So, this at the very least we have that. So that, I hope, gets somewhere to answering your question. It's a matter of immediacy, a matter of urgency, because of course art isn't immediate. That's one of the things it's good at. I mean, this is sort of Kant's most basic principle. It's useless, right? And I don't want to ramble, but the one last thing I would point out about when do you step in and say no is the other sort of big tripwire we haven't hit yet, which is the diversity question, and which I know we're running out of time, but I do want to get to, not only in terms of who writes, but who is written about. The exhibitions that I care about, the artists that I care about, are, I'm happy to say, I seem to have an inclination for, not only straight white men, and yet nevertheless I also sort of step back objectively and sort of make sure that I'm doing that. At the same time, given that sort of 1 or 0 phenomenon that you were speaking about, I do think it's really important that as we get more and more serious about who we write about, whom we write for, and who gets to do the writing, that everybody gets bad reviews too, and not just that it becomes a project of pure advocacy. So I know there's a bit of mind to throw in at the end.
I have one thought when we tie some things together about the diversity issue, which is the role that the critic plays in relationship to history. Because the critic is, one thing that has separated the critic from, say, the academic is that the critic is writing about production as it's happening, as it's being presented. And that the critic is having a response to the present, but one that, and maybe this goes, maybe more in Enlightenment model, occurs in relationship to the stakes of history, right? And the stakes of history are always like big stakes. So, for example, one thing we found in 4 columns was actually that we published a lot of work around the issue of blackness. And I think that was not because we were like seeking out diversity, but it was also, there was a historical urgency around those questions and around those practices that had been put into play by broader circumstances, both preceding the Trump election and obviously exacerbated by the election of Trump. And so I think we talk about the future of criticism being at the point of the panel, and I think certainly the future of criticism is very interested in this political moment and in this historical moment and the role that the critic has as someone who operates with a foot in the present, in the trenches, on the front line, but also in relationship to the stakes of history, which I think are one stand-in for your idea of the stakes of truth. This seems to me a very germane, like a very provocative, interesting, and hopefully generative moment for criticism, as I think it is for art as well.
So, our time is up. I think that's a great place to stop, but let's give our critics a hand.